I am Glenn, and welcome to the Northeast Georgia History Center's virtual content. Today is a listener requested subject on canals. Now, this is an interesting one because there have been lots of canals through history. I think we all sort of know what a canal is, but just to make sure, I want to do what a good historian always does and define our terms. A canal is a man-made waterway. It is not a natural waterway necessarily, or it connects to a natural waterway to move water. Now, it's not always to move ships, not always to move boats. Sometimes canals are dug to move water to a place so that it can provide power for machinery. Remember, in the pre-electrical era, the Industrial Revolution required a lot of water wheels and a lot of water-powered mechanics to make machines go. And so getting that water to where the factories were was an important part of it. Canals can also be totally man-made in just a super straight line. Sometimes they could take advantage of natural features that already exist, like downhill slopes, or even lakes and rivers and streams and things like that. But it's a way to move water or to put water where it wasn't before for a lot of different reasons. I'm going to go back to the first and earliest canal that I personally know of that was cut during the Persian and Greek wars. This one was done, I believe, in 481 BC when the great king Xerxes from Persia decided to invade the Greek city-states of Attica and Peloponnesia. And he had sent a fleet earlier, and the fleet had gone around an area called the Chalcidice. It's 3 fingers of land that come out, and it's very dangerous to sail ships there. He had lost half of a fleet earlier, and he thought to himself, well, you know what? I'm not going to take my ships where it's dangerous. I'm just going to cut a canal across land, 1, so that my ships are safe, and 2, to prove to the Greeks that I, the great king, can accomplish anything. And you have to understand that in the ancient world, everything is muscle power, and this is a mind-bogglingly gigantic feat. And you can see here this aerial view of that peninsula, and the canal is cut sort of across that isthmus. We're going to get to what an isthmus is in a moment, but this takes about a year and a half to do. He sends engineers ahead before the invasion even begins, while he's still assembling his fleet and armies, sends the engineers ahead to cut this canal. Now, the Greeks, interestingly enough, from a religious perspective, thought this was a lot of hubris. And with that hubris, they thought he's not pleasing the gods. He's putting water where land should be and land where water should be. And turns out the great king Xerxes lost his war against the Greeks, but that is a story for another day. But it is one of the earliest canals. Unfortunately, almost every vestige of that canal is lost today. The archaeologists have to go in with ground-penetrating radar to discover exactly where it's at. But the isthmus, right? I want to show you a world map here so that we can kind of get an idea of what a canal is or where they need to go. For transport, for allowing ships to move from one place to the other, you can either dig a canal through country, or you can take advantage of an isthmus. Isthmus. And an isthmus is simply a narrow neck of land which divides 2 larger bodies of water. And the world, you can see by the map here, there are a lot of places where ships can go, but there are some places that you think, you know, if my ship could just cross right here, it could cut off a lot of travel time and a lot of going through dangerous areas. And so the 2 big ones that exist in the world that people wanted to try to work with were the Panama Isthmus and the Suez Isthmus. Panama, of course, is that little narrow strip that divides the entire Atlantic and Pacific Oceans there in that narrow part. And the Suez Canal is in what's now Egypt, and it divides the Red Sea from the Mediterranean. And I'm going to come back to both of those in just a moment. Now, there is one other isthmus that I want to talk about because we've already talked about Greece, and this is one of those areas where history just topples everything on because of location. This is the Isthmus of Corinth in Greece. And this small, narrow stretch of land is a place where a city was built, Corinth. Corinth became one of the most powerful and richest cities in ancient Greece because it sat astride this land pathway between the Peloponnese and Attica, the rest of Greece and mainland Eastern Europe. That made it very rich. But, it would also be great if people could cut a canal. Well, the Greeks aren't the people, the ancient Greeks aren't the people to do that and anger the gods. Again, putting water where the land is supposed to be. But in more modern times, it is a perfect place for a canal. And in this next photograph, you can see how complex canals can be, right? Look at this. How deep is this? It is cut in actual rock and sediment all the way down, big enough and just wide enough for pretty big ships to go. You can kind of see how important this is. It prevents the ships from having to go all the way around the entire Peloponnese. They can just cut through. Takes a lot of time and a lot of danger off of their journey. Now, moving forward quite a bit, canals are major engineering feats, and they're not very common. They're here and there in the ancient and in the medieval world and in the Renaissance world. But when we get to the early modern period, especially in the boom of the Industrial Revolutions, canals start to play a big role, and they play an especially big role in England and in Great Britain. And in this photograph, you see one of the canals that were dug all through England. These are not very big canals. They're nothing like that one that I showed you of Corinth and the ones we'll talk about later in Suez and Panama, but they're just big enough and they go a long way. They cut through the countryside so that coal, manufactured goods, cloth can all be moved easily from one place to the other. The interesting thing about canals is if you can get the water flowing, you don't even need that much muscle power, right? You can just put your barge full of coal or full of manufactured goods into the water and let it float under its own power all the way where it needs to go. It may not be fast, but it certainly is cheap. Instead of having to load tons and tons of coal onto tens and hundreds of wagons to be pulled by mules and horses and oxen that have to be fed, have to be shoed, have to be cared for, you plop it in the boat and you let it float. Way cheaper to move things that way. Waterways make all the difference. And in this next photograph, you can see this is at a historic preservation site in England. You can see some of the boats, the barges they would use. Again, these canals don't have to be big. They just have to be able to carry a lot of traffic. So these boats could just stack up one to the other, one to the other. And then at certain points in the canal, like shown here, they can widen the canal so that it can come up to quays next to manufacturers, our factories, our towns where these goods need to be unloaded. These canals were dug all over England. And because of that, they really drove the Industrial Revolution before railroads. Really a modern marvel at the time because it requires a lot of, you can't just dig a ditch and line it with bricks and expect it to work. You have to take into account local water tables. You have to take into account the rise and fall of land because early on, they had to dig them where it was fairly level. They eventually developed a system of locks, and I'll get to those when I show you that for the Panama Canal. In the United States, in the early United States, this need for creating transport arteries to get goods and services and raw materials back and forth was also something that was of paramount importance to the nation. It's interesting because it also is intertwined with some of that early American political wrangling. There were folks in the North where there were plenty of waterways and plenty of manufactories and factories. They wanted to have the federal government help with private industry as well to build these canals because it's going to increase the goods that can go to market, how far they can go to new markets, and the speed and lower the cost for the average citizen. Well, that means the federal government's going to have to foot the bill. And if the federal government's footing the bill, that means it's tax money. And this gave rise to a big controversy in early American history with the American plan, right? We're talking about Henry Clay and Calhoun and Webster and those guys in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s because they wanted the American government to fund this infrastructure support, roads, canals, and eventually railroads. But a lot of states were not in favor of it because they're like, well, why should you take tax money from us down here in Georgia and build a canal in New York? How is that going to benefit us? Well, the idea was, well, we'll build the canal there first, and eventually we'll build canals down here. So it became, in effect, a states' rights issue. And there was a big project that had been planned in New York State called the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was going to link the Great Lakes all the way across the upper part of New York State and connect it to the Hudson River. Federal government funding fell through. This became one of the most successful public-private partnerships as far as a state government and private investors go. This takes a long time to build, but what it does, this investment in the Erie Canal makes New York City the most important financial center in the entire country. Because what it means is all the manufacturing that comes from everywhere in the Great Lakes, anywhere the Great Lakes can touch, they're going to put it on boats, float it down to the Erie Canal in Buffalo, New York, float it all the way to the Hudson River, and it's going to come down the Hudson River, an already existing waterway, and become part of New York's economy, part of New York's export-import business. Things can come through New York, go up the Hudson, go through the Erie Canal, and go to all the Great Lakes. It is a phenomenal economic boom to New York, and quite honestly, the reason New York is the powerhouse it is today, the largest city, the financial capital of the United States, is because of the Erie Canal. And the canal companies, of course, became rich doing this. They even began to issue their own money. And we've got a couple of examples here of they would actually issue money because their stock was worth so much, and they needed to find some type of means to engage in commerce, and silver and gold coins were hard to come by, so they began to issue money. If you want to know more about the banking system in the United States before the Federal Reserve, go and watch one of our other mini documentaries on banking and finance in the United States. I'm pretty sure you can find it on our YouTube channel. So that's sort of, an early industrial look, but as time goes on and as we go from a focus on local economics and local politics to a larger international world with the growth of the British Empire and other empires, they began to look at ways to foster international, global trade and make it better and faster. And they began to look at those, especially those two isthmuses that I was speaking of. We'll look at Suez first, because at this point, the British Empire is by far the most powerful and richest empire in the world, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire, and it is rich because it has a global trade with global colonies, and it needs to get goods and services on ships to and from those colonies to the mother country and back as fast as possible. If they wanted to send something, for example, to India, the jewel in the crown, they would have to leave England, go all the way down the west coast of Africa, go around the Cape of Good Hope, come back up, and go all the way to India that way. And they began to think, we already control the Mediterranean. What if we could dig a canal from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and cut off having to go around the entire continent of Africa? And this is what they did. And you can see from this map, they took advantage of pre-existing natural features, right? This isn't just a big straight line canal. It is for about half of it, but then it takes advantage of a pre-existing lake so the ships can go through the lake, and then they dig a canal from the lake into the Red Sea area. This means that it becomes one of the most strategic points in the entire British Empire. It is owned by the British government. It is patrolled by British military forces and held by British military forces for a long time, actually until the 1950s. But building it, of course, has to take place with the technology of the time. And you see in this next photograph, we're still talking about steam engines and things like that. They're having large floating cranes and diggers go along and basically dig their way as they go through the canal, right? It's a pretty amazing effort that they undertake to make this canal. They have to make it, they can't just dig straight down into the earth the way they did at Corinth, right? Those walls in Corinth are solid rock. They're not going to collapse. But here in the Suez, it's dirt, it's clay, it's sand. So if you dig it straight down, the sides are just going to collapse in a year or so. What they have to do is they have to make it remarkably wide so that it's shallow, so that the sides are not necessarily going to collapse, which means it's a much wider canal so that it can go down to the depth that it needs. And as a result, they're able to move and transport things through there. And we'll talk about how important that choke point is. But just to give you a little taste of this, some of you may remember, this was only about a year ago, the transport ship, the Evergreen, got stuck in the Suez Canal. How would you like to be the poor guy who was driving this thing or the insurance company that had to insure it? You can see here from this aerial photograph, it is stuck in the canal and it clogged up world transport for weeks because of this one ship, just to give you an idea of how important these canals can be. Now I want to move to the Panama Canal there at the Isthmus. This is something that the United States decides to do, again, because it is a growing empire, and the United States has a unique perspective. They have the Monroe Doctrine saying that Europe should not interfere in the New World, and thanks to Theodore Roosevelt when he was president, the Roosevelt Corollary, which says that not only should Europe not intercede in the New World, but that the United States should intercede where it can benefit the most people. And Roosevelt decided that one of the best ways to do that was to finally build that canal that folks had been talking about. So he, in a very complex set of circumstances, basically purchases/takes over just enough land in Panama to create the Panama Canal Zone that is owned and operated by the United States government. And they bring in public-private contracts, and they begin to dig. And you can see in this first picture, they're really just sort of beginning to shallow this out. But as time goes by, this also becomes one of the major engineering feats in history. In the next photograph, you can see they're pouring concrete and block walls that go deep, because the thing with Panama is that Panama isn't nearly as flat as the Suez area is between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. There are hills. And so to make this work, the Panama Canal has to have a series of locks. What a lock is it's certain channels in the canal where you can close the sides and pump water in and out to raise ships to a certain level. Very big, very heavy ships. This isn't something that happens very quickly. It can take hours and hours to fill these locks. As the gates rise, you'll go in, close the gate, you'll pump water into it so that the ship can then open at this lock and go on in this way. So this is how they're able to solve the problem of going over hills and things, but it's a massive project. In this next photograph, you can see how big one of these lock gates are, because they know that the bigger the ships, the bigger the economy, and the bigger this canal is going to have to be. The United States is now a burgeoning world power, an imperial power, and it's even competing for largest navy with Great Britain. The United States has a problem, though. It has interest in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And on paper, that means that it has to have a navy as big in the Atlantic as it does in the Pacific. In other words, it's going to have to spend twice as much money to build twice as many ships to patrol each ocean, because going around Cape Horn for a fleet is just not an option except in a dire emergency. But if we have and can control the Panama Canal like we did in World War II, then we'll be able to have just one fleet, and we can move it back and forth to the oceans as it is needed, and we can do that a lot faster. So the Panama Canal is not just an economic boom, it is a military necessity. It just like the Suez Canal was for the British. So you can see, putting it into that kind of framework, the canals in the world and the choke points for waterborne trade are incredibly important. This is where all the trade goes, which means they're of strategic importance, and therefore the militaries have to guard them too. And you can see from this map that the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal are still incredibly important in the world's trade, and therefore, unfortunately, can serve as flashpoints in terms of international relations or in terms of fear of terrorism, right? There are still a lot of forces that are there guarding the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, because even something as harmless as a single ship accidentally getting stuck bound up world trade for about 2 months. Can you imagine if a determined foe decided to take a military force in there or take it over or destroy it? That's going to tangle up trade for years. It could be a major concern. But I do want to bring things back a little closer, because I sort of skipped over the importance of canals in the American economy. And to highlight that, we have asked a very special lady to join us, Miss Martha Capwell Fox from the Delaware and Lehigh National Trail, who's going to tell us a little bit about the history of their canal system in that area and how it came to be, the importance of it, and how it eventually now is a historic park and a tourist destination. All right, everyone. So we are very excited to have a topic expert with us today. Martha, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your museum, and why the interest of canals is so important where you're from.
Well, my name is Martha Capwell Fox, and I am the historian and the archives coordinator for the National Canal Museum. The National Canal Museum, which has been in existence for 50 years, is a program now of the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor, which the Canal Museum was instrumental in presenting to Congress to authorize the area as the second National Heritage Corridor in 1988. And that's because the corridor itself preserves and celebrates the transportation route that carried anthracite coal from the mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania, first by canal to market both in Philadelphia and New York. This was in the early 19th century, in the 1820s, because the anthracite began to be able to be delivered in large quantities, very efficiently and very cost effectively. This essentially triggered the American Industrial Revolution here in eastern Pennsylvania.
Building a canal is not as simple as a couple of guys with shovels digging a ditch from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. It takes a lot. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of work. So tell us, whose idea for the canals that you're talking about that fuel this second industrial revolution up there in the Northeast. Whose idea was it? Who actually got it going, and what kind of combination was there, if any, between a public-private partnership, or who financed it and who gained the most, I guess?
Well, the triggering impulse for building the canals was, in fact, the discovery of anthracite coal at various places in the mountains of Pennsylvania between about 1785 or so and the early 1790s. This was kind of a curiosity more than anything at first. Very few people lived in northeastern Pennsylvania, but a few people thought that there might be a good market for this as an alternative fuel. And they started to quarry it. The problem was getting it to someplace where somebody could buy it and use it. And that didn't happen. A number of people who bought up vast amounts of land in the regions we call the coal regions now, went bust, because by the time they got it to Philadelphia, which had to be in wagons over lousy roads, carrying 1 or 2 tons of it, it was too expensive. And people didn't know what to do with it anyway, because it's really hard to get anthracite to catch fire. It's very, very hard. And besides that, I mean, here we are in Penn's Woods, right? And we had wood. Well, right. That only lasted as an abundant source of fuel until about 1800. 150 years worth of European settlement had just destroyed the forests in the middle Atlantic states. And one of the things that destroyed it actually was the fact that eastern Pennsylvania and central New Jersey were the iron-making parts of the United States at that point. In those days, iron furnaces burned charcoal. And it takes an acre of hardwood trees to make enough charcoal to make a ton of iron. And that sounds like a lot until you start making cannons. And so the Revolutionary War and just development in general had really depleted the forest to the point where wood was becoming scarce and expensive, which sounds familiar, right? We've had this a couple of times now in our lifetime. And so that renewed the interest in anthracite coal. But it wasn't actually until after the War of 1812 that there got to be more interest in exploiting the coal again. By that point, they had begun to do the preliminary work of building the Erie Canal. Now, the Erie is really important because that was the first major civil engineering project in the United States. There was no civil engineering knowledge in this country. But here in Pennsylvania, unlike with New York's business, the coal regions were reachable by rivers, not very navigable rivers, not navigable at all rivers, let's put it that way. And so in 1818, there were 2 businessmen in Philadelphia who were named Josiah White and Erskine Hazard. And they had been operating a wire and nail mill in Philadelphia. And obviously, if you're going to take iron and soften it up so that you can draw it out to make wire or cut it up into nails, you need fuel. And they managed to buy one of these failed coal quarries for literally an ear of corn a year.
There's paperwork to back this up, right?
Right. Yes, yes. So this particular iron quarry was in what's now Carbon County, and it was about 9 miles from the Lehigh River. The problem with the Lehigh is that it's shallow and it's rocky in a lot of places, or else it's really deep and slow moving in other places. They got a hold of this quarry, and then they went to the legislature in Harrisburg, and they said, you know, we've figured out a way to get this coal successfully, cheaply, efficiently to Philadelphia. But to do this, you have to give us the Lehigh River. And the legislature said, sure, take the river, take the water power rights, take the islands in the river, of which there were about a dozen, take the tributaries and the banks on either side of the river. We'll get them back in a few years. Everybody loses their shirt in this stupid coal business. Well, Pennsylvania got the Lehigh River back in 1966.
Wow.
It was the only privately owned river in the United States. And so there they were with a coal mine up on top of the hill and a river 9 miles away and 600 feet lower. And so they proceeded to do two things. They built a stone road that connected the mine to the bank of the river. And it was the first road that was ever built in the United States with a standard declivity, meaning it came down the hill at a steady angle instead of following the terrain. And you can go up to outside the town of Jim Thorpe, and you can still hike on that road, and you can still see where they piled up the dirt to make a nice, smooth road. And while one part of the team was doing that, Josiah White was building 13 low-head dams in the river, which had a hydrostatic gate at one side, and that would back up the water behind the dam deep enough to float basically boxes of coal that were chained together over the rocks. And what they'd do is they'd get the coal down on the wagons, down to the riverbank, load up the boxes, chain them together, line them all up behind the dam, and then somebody on the front would get up on the dam and shut off the flow of water that held the gates upright. And so when the water was cut off, the gates fell, and this flume, like an amusement park, went through there, and they rode down the river. And they started to build this in 1819, and in 1820, they delivered 28,000 tons of coal to Philadelphia, entirely by way of the Lehigh that had 13 of these dams. And then the Lehigh flows into the Delaware River here in Easton, and the Delaware takes you to Philadelphia. And people loved it. It was cheap. It made a hot fire. It heated the house really nicely. There were some big buildings in Philadelphia in those days, like what we now call Independence Hall,
Right.
and University of Pennsylvania Hospital. And as fast as they could get it to Philadelphia, they could sell it. So they did this for a couple of years. But the trouble with that is that that's one way. Those boxes go down. They don't come back.
Right.
And that was depleting the lumber even worse. So by 1826, after the Erie Canal was completed, Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company then decided to build a two-way navigation on the Lehigh River. So they nevertheless had the great good sense and humility to hire an engineer named Canvas White, who had learned how to do canal building on the Erie Canal. He came to Pennsylvania. And in the case of the Lehigh navigation, what they did was they incorporated the river and ditch parts of the canal. So they built 9 dams on the Lehigh, and behind each one of those dams, they got the river deep enough and slow enough for canal boats carrying 100 tons of coal on them to be on the normally shallow, rocky Lehigh. And those connected then through a series of locks into ditch parts of the canal. And the amazing thing about this is that they went 46 miles. They built 48 locks, 9 dams, all those lock tenders' houses, and they did it in 2.5 years.
Wow.
And under budget too, under budget and ahead of schedule.
And so this is
Um,
all. This is all at this point still 100% private, right?
this one is 100% private. Lehigh
Yeah.
Coal and Navigation was one of the first shareholder corporations in the United States. They then had this huge monopoly. They owned the coal mine. They owned the gravity railroad that then was replaced, the stone road that carried the coal down to the thing. They owned the river. They owned the boats. They owned the coal docks in Philadelphia. The one thing that they were stuck with, though, is that when they got to Easton, there was no canal to go to Philadelphia. It had to go down the Delaware. Pennsylvania was beginning to also build its own canal network. The same year, 1826, they began construction of the Delaware Canal, which starts here in Easton at its northern end, and it goes to Bristol. The trouble was Pennsylvania. They built it. They built it on the cheap. They used really poor planning. And the long and the short of it is that they relied on the Lehigh Coal and Navigation to divert water from the Lehigh River into the Delaware. So they were already kind of, selling their soul in a way. But the Lehigh was willing to build this dam that diverted the water into the Delaware because they wanted a canal route that would get them closer to Philadelphia. Problem was that then when they did finally put water into the canal, it only reached about as far as New Hope, which was only about halfway, and it blew out the banks of the canal all the way down. So had to be rebuilt. It was not completed as a complete thoroughfare until 1834.
Wow.
But that made a very easy path to go directly from the coal fields to Philadelphia, which was altogether about 120 miles. And they were able to move enormous quantities of coal as well. So that really established them as a successful company. The state actually found out that the only stretch of canal that they were making any money on eventually was on the Delaware Canal, because the rest of the system just was too costly and went the wrong places and all sorts of things like that.
Right.
Pennsylvania did have more miles of canal, though, than any other state in the country, almost 3,000.
So it sounds like that the Pennsylvania Canal that goes in there at Easton was successful because it tied into this privately owned transportation canal, right? So
Yes.
you could say that the best benefit was a private-public partnership when it came to it. Is that an accurate statement?
It is, yeah, it is more or less. In fact, what happened was that by the 1850s, when Pennsylvania was basically rapidly deciding that the whole canal thing was a really bad idea, and they were selling off enormous stretches of canal all over the state, they first leased and then basically handed over total control of the Delaware Canal to the Lehigh Coal and Navigation. That setup existed until 1931.
Wow.
The Lehigh and the Delaware canals were the last operating towpath canals in the United States. The Delaware closed in 1931. The Lehigh operated on a limited basis until 1942. There was very little navigation by that point. Mostly they were dredging coal dirt and burning it in various factories and stuff up and down the river, but it was destroyed in flood. The other thing that it connected to, though, that is really important, and this is also started out as a public-private canal project, was the Morris Canal in New Jersey. The Morris starts in Phillipsburg, which is directly across the Delaware from Easton, and it goes across the narrow kind of waste of New Jersey to New York Harbor. So that meant that basically Easton, which was the only place in the United States where 3 canals came together, was basically the energy crossroads of the United States.
Wow.
From about 1840 to 1870. Because anthracite was so incredibly energy efficient that it essentially powered the entire Northeast and Upper Midwest until the 1920s.
Right. That's kind of a big deal.
Yes.
Yeah, that's in effect. That's like someone saying that they could control the electricity for For the Middle
Yeah,
Atlantic and New England states, right? That's the
yeah,
modern equivalent.
yeah. It was close to that, and there were a whole bunch of competing interests because it wasn't just the Lehigh and the Delaware system, but the Schuylkill Canal, which actually had a shorter route down along the Schuylkill River from the western part of the coal fields in Schuylkill County. It was a straight shot down the Schuylkill River to Philadelphia, and then not too much later, the way northern coal fields around Wilkes-Barre and Scranton became connected all the way across northeastern Pennsylvania, southeastern New York to the Hudson. And then it was carried first on boats that were towed down the Hudson to New York. And then all that was, of course, eventually replaced by railroads. Mostly the canal companies either segued into running railroads or somebody else started a railroad and then they were taken over.
That's really, the question I was going to ask to kind of bring us to the end of the Great Canal era. Was it just railroads? Was it predominantly railroads, or was it just a huge variety of factors?
No, it was railroads.
Just period.
Yeah, yeah. The thing that's interesting, and we have documents that are kind of show, and it might have been coal company propaganda, that the canals were still capable of beating the price per ton of moving coal until the 1890s. But there was, I mean, they really they couldn't go anywhere near as fast as the trains could. Mm-hmm. It got to the point where when locomotives got strong enough in the 1870s that a train could easily carry vastly more coal than even a really large canal boat could carry.
Right.
And they also didn't shut down in the wintertime. Canals close when it freezes. And so they really only had about a 9 or 10 month season, whereas the railroads ran forever. So it was eventually the railroads that wiped them out. But what's remarkable is how long, that most of the canals stayed in existence. They were mostly all gone by about 1900, but there were a few places where parts of the Pennsylvania Canal out in Western Pennsylvania were still operating, partly, I think, because that part of Pennsylvania is kind of empty in a way. And then there were also places, particularly in Bucks County, that the railroads never went. And so there were coal yards, for instance, and industries that totally relied on having anthracite delivered by boat right to their door. And so they kept on doing that until it just was not economically feasible anymore.
Right. But I mean, your point is good. They did eventually get phased out, but canals are what drove the second industrial revolution in this country, right?
Actually, the first industrial revolution.
Excuse me, yes.
I mean, there is a school of thought that still gives the birth of the Industrial Revolution to the water-powered textile mills in New England. But there are a lot of business and industrial historians who now agree that it was the adoption of mineral fuel to power iron machinery, first of all, to make iron, and then to power iron machinery. And that's what happened. Yeah. And, all of those things were part of what triggered an enormous influx of wave upon wave upon wave of immigration, too.
Yeah.
The Irish, a lot of the people who built the canals here had survived building the Erie, and so they came for that kind of work, and then the next wave of Irishmen started to build the railroads. Eventually it all kind of like massed together, and it really did contribute. It contributed to staggeringly fast development.
Right.
For instance, South Bethlehem, which was where Bethlehem Steel was, in 1850 consisted of 6 farms and about 4 dozen people lived on it. And in 1900, there were 29,000 people.
Wow.
In 50
for
years.
For one steel mill.
From one iron mill.
Iron mill, yeah.
And also a place where they made zinc and they made all sorts of other stuff. And because it was all right there. And 2 railroad lines went through.
Right.
So, I mean, it's people think that rapid development is a characteristic of our times, but it was as rapid and as radical then as it is now in a lot of ways.
And folks, as you can guess, we have just scratched the surface of what kind of effect canals have had on that kind of growth and on the history of the company, the history of the country. But that's again more than we can cover today. Martha, can you tell us just a little bit before we go how folks can find out more about you and your museum and where they can go to get that information?
Oh, yes. Well, hopefully we will have people again begin to visit because we have had people from all over the country in the past. Our website is www.canals.org. DNL, the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridors, is www.delawareandlehigh.org. And on there, you can learn about the DNL Trail, which is very nearly connected from Wilkes-Barre all the way to Bristol and follows that historic transportation trailway. The other thing, if people are interested in learning more, is that there's information about our local history on our website. And you can also buy some of the books that the museum has published over the years on the website, as well as the new guide to the DNL Trail, which also contains a lot of historical information. So hopefully we will have a real regular season, and I hope you will as well.
Yes.
And we will have many visitors again soon.
Well, good. I hope so. Hopefully some folks that have seen this will come up and see you. Thank you so much for joining us, Martha. It has been a very educational treat, and we hope to see you soon.
I would love to visit you as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this presentation on canals. We hope you've enjoyed being with Ms. Capwell Fox to looking at the global perspective, bringing it down to a more local perspective. It's a very fascinating subject. And as always, I encourage you to do more reading. So thank you for being a member. Thank you for watching these mini documentaries that we've been preparing just for you. We hope you go back and look at our body of work. But until we see you again, either online or at the History Center, please stay safe and take care.
And welcome back to another members live stream here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. I am Marie Bartlett, and I am the Director of Education here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. And today I'm going to talk to you about a quintessential American garment, the history of blue jeans. Denim is a durable cloth. It was very much worn by the working classes, so people who worked as farmers or people who worked in factories wore denim because it was durable. Also, those who were enslaved were often seen wearing denim. They might wear coats or pants that were made from this blue denim cloth. Fabric was often dyed dark blue. It doesn't have to be dyed dark blue, but it was often dyed dark blue because once indigo became easily cultivated, it became a cheaper dye, and also the blue, it hides stains. So when you're wearing work clothes, you don't want them to show the dirt or any oil, grease, whatever else you might get upon yourself while working. Now, its origins trace back to several different places across the globe. American manufacturers, though, we believe that they shortened the name Serge de Nimes because this was fabric that was made in the Nimes, France, or fabric of Nimes, France, to just denim. So it goes from the Nimes to denim. But these pants that were made out of these blue indigo dyed denim, they were just pants. They were just like any other pants. They were just made out of this certain type of fabric. So you could say that those were blue jeans, but they weren't like our iconic version of blue jeans that like we know and love today. So the history of our iconic American blue jeans, it kind of does start with people moving out west. So the story of blue jeans, I believe, really begins with these two men who immigrated to America from Europe. And then they headed out west to make their fortune during this great westward expansion in the mid to late 1800s. So the first of these two men to settle in the American West was Levi Strauss. In 1853, he arrived in San Francisco, California, and he decided that he was going to become a merchant and opened up a wholesale dry goods business. Levi Strauss and Co. That might sound familiar to you. But at his dry goods business, he sold clothing, he sold blankets and handkerchiefs and fabric, along with other things. He had denim cloth, but he did not make pants out of it. So, who really came up with this idea of blue jeans then? Well, in 1869, Jacob Davis opened a tailor shop on the main street of Reno, Nevada. And while he was in Nevada and he opened up this tailoring shop, his customers were mainly the workers on the Central Pacific Railroad. Of course, the railroad also central to westward expansion. Davis, technically his shop is a tailor shop, but he didn't just make, suits for fine men. He also made items such as tents, horse blankets, wagon covers, a lot of utilitarian objects that you don't always think of a tailor in our day and age making, but it's someone who could sew, and you're out west, you're going to need a lot of more utilitarian things, right? And the fabric that Davis would make all of these things out of, like these wagon covers, blankets, pants, it was a heavy-duty cotton duck cloth, and also cotton denim. So he bought this cotton denim from a dry goods store called Levi Strauss & Co. So there we have our first connection of these two men. So these men out west, they were wearing through their pants faster than they could patch them up. And also they would store things in their pockets like hammers and attempt to put like pickaxes and all of these really heavy things in their pockets. And their pockets were just falling off. They would just rip because they were sewn, but the fabric was not durable enough to actually hold it on to the pants. So Jacob Davis got this idea for making sturdier pants. So Davis thought about this, and he decided that one solution would be to add reinforcing metal rivets to the pants at stress points. So stress points, where we put the most stress on our pants, where we pull and stretch them the most. Having these metal rivets there would reinforce the stitching on the pants so that it would hopefully hold more and hold longer. And it worked. It worked. It made the pants hold up so much longer, and they became incredibly popular, like really, really popular, to the point where like everyone wanted a pair of these blue jeans that were riveted together because they just held up so much better than anything else. So Jacob Davis decided that he needed to get a patent on these metal riveted pants. But he did not have the funds required for a patent. Jacob Davis wrote to the cloth merchant who had been supplying his denim, Levi Strauss. Had not met him, had only bought cloth from him, and Levi thought that this was a fantastic business deal and heartily agreed to put up the money for the patent and also to then have a portion of that patent. So the two men go into business together, and they get a patent for copper riveted workwear. So the patent process is not for blue jeans. It's for this process of copper riveting the workwear. So a patent is awarded by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office on May 20th, 1873, and now, since that is the day that the patent was awarded, it is considered to be the birthday of blue jeans. But the pants were not called blue jeans at this time. That will not come for another 100 years or so. In fact, they were called waist overalls. Yes, indeed, waist overalls. Overalls was kind of this catch-all term for workwear at the time. When we say overalls, we mean a very specific garment. When they said overalls, they kind of just meant workwear. So these original waist overalls, they have one back pocket. These waist overalls also had a watch pocket, which we still have on our pants today. Sometimes people refer to it as like a coin pocket, but in fact it is for your pocket watch. And of course, these waist overalls, they had copper rivets at the corner of all of their pockets, and they also had a copper rivet at the base of the fly. This is something that no longer is on blue jeans, but was included in the original design. There was also a cinch on the back. At this time, belts were not worn with pants. That does not come until later, so you have a cinch in the back to, well, make it fit you, to make the pants fit you, and then you would have suspenders to hold it up. So, of course, you also have suspender buttons on the top of your waist overalls. So these pants that they decided to start making in large quantities were made out of a 9-ounce XX blue denim, and this denim came from the Amoskeag Mill in Manchester, New Hampshire. But while they got all of their fabric from this mill in New Hampshire and New England, the production of the jeans, of the waist overalls, happened in San Francisco, California, and Strauss actually brought Davis to San Francisco to oversee the manufacturing of the waist overalls he had come up with. It was probably a combination of factory production and also home sewing, so it was also a thing in the mid to late 1800s. Instead of just having a factory where you have workers come and produce the garment, you would also send, it's kind of like a home sewing kit that you would send to workers, and then these ladies would complete it in their home and then bring it back. So it was probably a combination of factory production and also this home sewing method. We aren't sure exactly because Levi Strauss records were destroyed in the Great San Francisco Fire and earthquake of 1906. From guesswork and from stories and from what people have said, we believe that it to be a factory and home sewing process. The design of these waist overalls continues to be altered. Just a little bit though, because these waist overalls have changed very, very little since their original design, but there are some minute details that have been replaced or just done away with over the past 100 years. Pretty much only the crotch rivet has been removed, and we wear what we can call jeans, what they would have called waist overalls, with belts instead of suspenders. Those are pretty much like the two main changes that have happened since the invention of jeans. The crotch rivet, people had been complaining about it since basically the invention of jeans. One story is that miners and also workmen, they like to stand near fires to keep warm, but rivets are metal, metal gets hot, you can put 2 and 2 together. So, waist overalls, they continue to be popular amongst miners, ranchers, and railroad workers throughout the end of the 1800s and into the 1900s themselves. In 1890, to be exact, the rivet patent that Levi Strauss & Co. had received, it went into the public domain. So in 1890, Levi Strauss & Co. are no longer the exclusive manufacturer of riveted waist overalls, of riveted work clothing. Also in 1890, lot numbers are first assigned to the products being manufactured by Levi Strauss & Co., which gives us what we still recognize today as the 501 jean, the 501 waist overall from Levi Strauss & Co. We are not sure why they decided to start adding batch numbers at this time, but it probably coincides with them losing their patent and it going into public domain, so they wanted something else to distinguish their pants, their waist overalls, from what they assume to be numerous imitators that will quickly come onto the scene. So 501 is first used to designate Levi Strauss & Company waist overalls in 1890. And it is still a very famous designator for the copper riveted waist overalls to this day. In 1902, Levi Strauss dies at the age of 73, and his nephew take over the business. Their descendants still run the company to this day. So Levi Strauss & Co. continue on under new leadership But of course, leadership, that's still very close to the original family, so they still very much are going in the same direction. Nothing really changes drastically within the company. They still continue to dominate the overall market of the sale of overalls, and through the First World War, not much changes in the design of jeans or the wearing of jeans. Of course, a lot of men go overseas, they end up wearing uniforms, which do not include jeans. But when they come back in the 1920s, we have a design change, and this is when belt loops are added to the Levi overalls. Suspender buttons are still present because at this time you still had people who liked to wear suspenders. You also had people who wanted to wear the more modern belt. And since the suspenders are still present and many people still like to wear the overalls with suspenders, there's also still a cinch present on the back of the pants. But the men, usually the younger men, who wanted to wear a belt with the pants would actually cut off the cinch to make it more comfortable to wear with a belt. Also during this time, waist overalls, or just overalls, were experiencing a lot of good press. Western movies have been popular as long as movies have been made. In the late 20s and into the 30s, we have another resurgence of the cowboy. And in 1930, John Wayne got his first big leading role in the movie The Big Trail, and it was a very successful movie. And of course, in a lot of these westerns, the heroes are wearing denim pants that are riveted together. So they continue to be very popular, but they still have not found their way into super mainstream culture in America yet. Pre-World War II, the world is still a very formally dressed place. Men wear their three-piece suits and hats, and ladies wear little gloves and pearls and hats. But during World War II, blue jeans, they became a part of the official uniform of the Navy and the Coast Guard. These jeans, these blue jeans, still at the time called overalls, became even more popular when worn as just off-duty leisure clothing, because they were like, wow, these are comfortable. We're just going to wear these even when we're not having to be in uniform. People like military fashion. The military is wearing jeans. Jeans are now going to become a part of everyday life and fashion as people are more accepting of, well, this is a piece of a military uniform. I'm going to also wear it. Show my patriotism. Show my Americanness. Also during World War II, changes were made to the overalls in order to conform to rules set by the War Production Board for the Conservation of Raw Materials, aka the Rationing Board. Things were rationed. Cloth was rationed, and also metal was rationed. What are overalls made out of? Cloth and metal. So they had to come up with a little bit of ways to get around that. So this is when the crotch rivet, the watch pocket rivets, the back cinch, these are all removed forever, pretty much, to save fabric and metal. This is when they all just go away and they don't really come back. 1947 was also a really big year for the image of jeans. In 1947, the post-war version of the 501 jean, Levi jeans, start coming off the production line. And this is what we would probably consider to be like our modern jean, because it doesn't have the cinch in the back. That's gone forever. The rivets are put back on the watch pocket. So that's something that has come back from war production that we're still pretty used to. Some jeans still have it, some don't. Depends on your brand. But for Levi's, those come back. And then also in 1947, that is when Hollister happened. So you might think of Hollister, isn't that a store? Well, yes, but that's not what we're talking about. We're actually talking about the invasion of Hollister, California, or as it is also known, the Hollister Riot. It is when a group of motorcyclists descend upon Hollister, California for a rally, for a gathering of other motorcycle enthusiasts. Well, it became a riot. Life magazine published this photo from the Hollister riots, where people believe that it was a staged photograph, but this one in particular where it's this man in jeans, in a leather jacket, and a white t-shirt on his motorcycle, and he's just driving over piles of empty alcohol and beer bottles. There are also a plethora of other photos that got published, and this is kind of where we can trace the idea of like the bad boy wearing jeans too. But this is when that becomes mainstream, it becomes popularized, and people begin to view this as almost an archetype, as a character type in American media and just in general. Another interesting thing that happens in the 50s, we get the zipper added to jeans. Up until this point, the zippered version of overalls was actually, well, didn't exist. It only had buttons, and that's how flies are buttoned up until, well, about this time. So in 1954, zippered versions of the overalls is introduced by Levi Strauss, and instead of just the 501 name, it is called 501Z, Z for zipper. This is also a time in the 50s and 60s where jeans, they're going through another image transformation. They had been the working man's clothes. They had been a working people's garment. And then they had kind of been associated with cowboys and kind of the glorified version of cowboys on the silver screen. And then they had been associated with World War II soldiers because men in the Navy and the Coast Guard would wear jeans as part of their uniform. But then we have the Hollister riots, and then jeans become kind of associated with the rebelling youth. And it seems to be jeans are one of their fashions of choice. And this is actually when we get the term jeans. So we start out with waist overalls, it then goes, and it's called waist overalls until about from the 1870s to 1920s. It's then just called overalls from the 1920s to the 1960s. And then starting in the 60s, we get the term jeans. The term jeans is not a new term. They did not make it up. They did not make these teens in the 60s did not make up the word jeans. The word jeans has actually been used since the 1600s to describe the rough clothing worn by working men, which of course is what waist overalls made out of denim are, is rough clothing worn by working men. So it seems like this is very much a fitting term. It didn't just come out of nowhere. But it just kind of pops up in the 1960s, and then it just really sticks. It sticks so much that Levi and all other major manufacturers start using this teen slang term, jeans, in the 1960s for their own advertisement. Because who are you trying to sell to? The young people who don't have jeans yet. And also, after World War II, you have the whole baby boomers. The baby boomers, they're coming of age in the 50s and into the 60s, and you have this thing called teen culture, which is kind of new. It used to just all culture and pop culture especially, it used to be about adults. But after World War II in the 50s and 60s, we start to have teen pop culture, and we see teens really driving pop culture. So pop culture including fashion, movie, slang, music, all now driven by teens. So, of course, since the teens are calling them jeans, that's what the adults are going to take their cue from. They're going to take their cue from the kids. So far, jeans have, in overalls and the waist overalls, they've all been very much worn by men. And we don't really see women wearing these overalls at all. We see it a smidge in the 1940s when women are going to work and they're working out on the farms, they're working in factories, they're taking over those jobs left by men. So you start to see women wearing the overalls at that point, but it doesn't really stick. You also have kind of like this idea of Americans would go out to Colorado and go out to a dude ranch and ride horses for a weekend and then come back. And sometimes they wore jeans while they were doing that as well. But they aren't part of like normal normal day dress for a lot of ladies. It was a kind of a rare occasion to wear jeans, or it was under very special circumstances, such as war work or vacationing to the West to pretend to be a cowboy. They're not part of your everyday wardrobe. But then we have Marilyn Monroe, who of course is a fashion icon, wearing jeans in her movie The Misfits in 1961, ushering in this idea of jeans being stylish for women. But jeans, they still kind of, at the 60s, they still had this very kind of like counter-cultural feel to them. Some jeans were popular at protest movements within the 60s. You have a lot of protest movements going on in the 60s. Of course, you have the civil rights movement, you have the gay rights movement, you have women's lib starting in the 60s too. So you have a lot of protest movements. You have protests against the Vietnam War. Some of these you see jeans at, and some you don't. And it's really interesting to see why. So at civil rights movements, a lot of those protests, you don't see a lot of people wearing jeans. Organizers of a lot of civil rights protests, they had what is called the Sunday best approach, meaning that you should dress up in your three-piece suit and your Sunday best dress and your little white gloves and your cute little hat to go march, because they wanted to be seen as very respectable members of society, to where if someone were to come and attack them, their image would be that of an upstanding citizen being attacked, rather than a quote-unquote juvenile delinquent wearing jeans being attacked. It does not elicit the same response from the person viewing said attack, perhaps. But some of the younger protesters in the civil rights movement, they did wear denim because they wanted to show solidarity with the Black working class. And they didn't want to leave the working class behind in their fights for rights, versus what the Sunday best approach, the criticism of that would be like, oh, well, at that point, you're all just showing Black middle and upper class people. So it's interesting how jeans kind of played a role in image, in protests, and also what people are trying to identify and show. In the late 60s and 70s, bell-bottom jeans became incredibly popular, especially among the section of the population who fashioned themselves as hippies. And these bell-bottom jeans were also worn to a lot of protests, mainly Vietnam War protests, protesting war, advocating for peace. And in these protests, jeans were worn in an effort basically to achieve the look of a classless society. So if you have a really rich person wearing jeans and you have a person who, is a working class person wearing jeans, they're wearing the same thing. How can you tell them apart? It wasn't until during the 80s when this change began, where basically famous fashion designers created designer jeans that made the middle and upper class people really take notice and want to wear jeans. Also in 1981, Levi's finally released their 501 jeans, but for women. So it was a woman's cut, especially for women. Of course, women had been wearing like 501 jeans for a very long time. They were just wearing the men's version. But in the 1980s, they finally made ones specifically for ladies. In the 90s, jeans continue to be incredibly popular. Once you have this designer jean craze and like everyone just seems to be wearing jeans regardless of class and station, at this point is like what type of jeans you have versus just if you were wearing jeans of being like your distinction of like class or style. And then also this is in the 80s and the 90s, we start to see like different types of jeans. At this point, it used to just be a very standard 501 jean. Like that was the jean, that was the pant, and there weren't different styles. But in the 90s, in the 80s, you get this acid wash. And in the 90s, you get the grunge look with like ripped, baggy jeans. And then by the end of the 20th century, blue jeans had become one of the most widely worn clothing items, not just in America, but in the world, as, well, society becomes more and more globalized. Low-rise jeans became really popular in the early 2000s. Skinny jeans were super popular in the 2010s. That might be where my jeans are from. There are just so many different styles of jeans today that are bought and sold and worn in literally every country around the world. Blue jeans are still, even though that they're worn around the world, they're still very much regarded as a fundamentally American garment. This is where they started. This is where they were made. And therefore, America, we don't have what we consider, I guess, quote unquote, folk clothing, like traditional outfits. I would argue that jeans are our traditional outfits. It's what it's our folk clothing, because folk clothing, and when you think of in other countries, it's very much a reminiscent of what their peasant farmers would have worn, but the folk costume is an idealized version of that generally came about in the 1800s as industrialization was happening, and they were looking back at this beautiful, in their minds they were considering this beautiful pastoral peasant life that has been fading away. So they kind of brought that fashion, idealized it, and that became their folk clothing, their traditional clothing. I very much argue that jeans are that for America. And now we have an interview with Dr. John Finley with some more thoughts about jeans and American identity. Welcome, Dr. Finley, to our miniature documentary about the history of blue jeans. Could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, my name is John Finley, and I'm Professor Emeritus in the Department of History at the University of Washington in Seattle.
And you have been researching the history of blue jeans. So could you share a little bit of your research with us?
Sure. I'm a historian of the modern American West, the 20th century West. I'm just finishing a book on the West from 1940s to 2000, and it's called The Mobilized West. Mobilized meaning partly the impact of World War I, and World War II, and the Cold War on the West, World War II and the Cold War. But I also look at quite a bit at what Westerners thought about themselves and the kind of symbols, the ways they attach themselves to the West. And one of the ways it did that is through clothing, and blue jeans is a prime example. So I've done a little bit of work on that as part of a much bigger book on many, many more topics than that. One of the things that really makes blue jeans popular and gives them different sorts of meanings is the way they're portrayed in movies and in popular culture more generally. And much of that portrayal is positive, cowboys, sheriffs, and so on in movies. But there were also outlaws as well as rebels. In the 1950s, there were two sort of actors, Marlon Brando and James Dean, who wear denim in really iconic movies. And those appearances become associated with rebellion and protest. And that's a very powerful set of images carrying into the 1960s, which is a decade of enormous protest and rebellion and demonstrations and so on. But again, there's also this kind of conservative cowboy symbolism going on too, and it's with the same darn pair of pants. And how that can be so flexible suggests a lot about our culture and just the fact that they're comfortable and attractive and so on. And in the 50s, not only movies, but TV shows really prioritized the West. And the number of TV shows devoted to the West in the late 50s and early 60s is just astounding. And again, people see this, especially more and more in color, and they say, oh, that's what I want to wear at home or on vacations and so on. So that's another thing. World War II is critical too. World War II puts the rest of the world on notice that here's an American fashion possibility that you might want to consider. A lot of people go to factories to sort of work to produce war material, Rosa the Riveter. And these men and women wear jeans in the factories, and that popularizes jeans one more time. Again, people who are trying them on for the first time, especially women, are people moving away from the farms, see them in a new light in these factory settings. And then American soldiers and sailors overseas also kind of wear them. And that sort of piques the interest of Europeans and Asians and others who are, they're seeing America in a new light and seeing cowboys in a new light. And here these soldiers and these sailors, whether off duty or even in some cases, in some of the sailors kind of issued clothing, denim is a feature of that, and it becomes more popular around the global level. So the global appetite for jeans actually takes off. And again, this is at a time when Levi Strauss is still seeing itself as something producing just for the American West. So that's important too. World War II does something else. It stops Americans from going to Europe to vacation, and it increases their vacation in the United States. And once the war is over, this vacationing in the United States increases enormously. National parks become popular. Towns like Deadwood or in South Dakota or Tombstone in Arizona become popular because of the Western violence, Western stories, again, propped up in so much by Hollywood. And Americans begin to vacation, not just in dude ranches, but all across the West. And increasingly, they go to sort of the outdoors, they go to national parks, they go to Disneyland and Las Vegas, which have kind of Western themes to their sort of amusement sort of economy. And that, again, focuses both Americans and other countries' attention on the West and denim or jeans as sort of something to be worn in the West. Right at the end of World War II, 1946, 1947, a new company emerges called Wrangler Jeans.
Mm-hmm.
And Wrangler Jeans, they're going to compete against Levi's and other companies. And one way they do that is they consult with rodeo cowboys about what kind of pants do you wear? What would be the best for you? Do you want rivets or not? Or do the pockets need to be put differently if you're going to ride in the saddle compared to where Levi's puts their pockets?
Mm-hmm.
And Wrangler then consults with and then advertises with, markets its products with rodeo cowboys who reinforce the message of jeans as part of the American West.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all these elements coming together between the 1920s and 1940s and 50s, promoting the idea of cowboys and dressing like cowboys. And each of these things across 2 decades or 3 decades just ratchets up the sort of the popularity and the symbolism of blue jeans. And an interesting moment comes after 1970 when people who make jeans go in different directions. So after the 1970s, you get the rise of designer jeans. People like Gloria Vanderbilt or Ralph Lauren or Tommy Hilfiger put their names on jeans, and the jeans are better fitting, they're more fashionable fabrics, but they're still jeans, and they're still, they may have different stitching, but they're still sort of jeans, but they're called designer jeans, and they're pretty expensive, and people try to find a designer with cachet, but also ones that fit their build nice. And that's an important new angle of jeans, designer jeans, with higher prices. But there's a second thing too that I just am dumbfounded by. These are stress jeans that you can buy new with holes already in them or worn spots already in them. Now, one of the things that made Levi Strauss jeans so popular when they came out in the 1870s was that they were really durable. The fabric was stiff, and it improved on previous jeans because it didn't tear so easily. They would get worn, but it didn't take as long to wear. It took a longer time to wear them down. But when people begin wearing jeans in the 50s and 60s, they're not laborers. They're not trying to they're not worried about the fabric getting worn down. They're in fact, one of the problems with Levi's is that they're too stiff when you get them, and you have to sort of go through a number of washer and draw cycles to get them more comfortable. So parents in the 60s would notice that their kids were wearing jeans that had holes in them or stresses, or patches, or they'd been restitched, and they would think, oh, they're just, they can afford a new pair of jeans, but they don't want to. They're stuck. They're too cheap, or they're protesting, whatever. Some of that might be true, but also the jeans that were older were more comfortable, and so there was this kind of appeal to these worn jeans because they weren't the stiff fabric anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So jeans manufacturers began to sort of figure out, okay, we can soften the fabric, we can acid wash or stone wash them, and that'll make it a different kind of look. They'll already be broken in a way. But they even went further, and that was they put in holes or worn spots. They pre-stressed the jeans and then sold them at a higher price than they would be without the damage, right? So there are some brands that become known for this too. Lucky brand, they're known as stressed jeans. But there's this sort of stressing that goes on in advance. So this reaches the kind of an epitome in the 1990s. A woman named Judy McFarland in Montana founds a company called Montana Broke.
Mm-hmm.
And what she does is she goes around in the state of Montana and buys used jeans from people who have been either cattle ranchers, rodeo riders, or sheriff's possemen. I'm not quite sure what a sheriff's posseman is. I guess if the sheriff needed someone to ride a horse and go get a criminal, maybe there was a posse, or he could deputize somebody. I'm not really sure. But Judy McFarland, she would go around the state trying to buy pre-worn or stressed jeans, but not stressed by the factory, stressed by people actually wearing them. And not just everybody, not a student at college or a housewife, but actual people with some sort of Western jobs, rodeo riders, cattle ranchers, or a sheriff's posseman. She would buy those jeans for $5 a piece, and she would sell them to stores in New York City or San Francisco where they'd market for $65 or $70 a pair. And not only did they come from Montana, they were accompanied by, in each case, a sort of certificate of authenticity saying, yeah, this is from a rodeo rider such and such, or this is from a cattle rancher who worked in this part of Montana. And you know he was a rodeo rider because there's this kind of stress or this kind of Warren's part, and not the other kind of stress that's associated with a sheriff's posse man or a cattle rancher. So there's a combination here of authenticity and sort of symbolism. Everyone knows that, cowboys, they're descended from 19th century cattlemen who actually did ride herd, but now cowboys, it's an athletic competition, right? People don't actually live on ranches and herd horses anymore, herd cattle anymore. They don't have those kinds of jobs. Their job is to be a rodeo rider. So it's kind of a manufactured or artificial cowboy, but it's nonetheless real enough that if that person has a pair of used jeans to sell, people are willing to pay 12 or 13 times what Trudy McFarland could buy for to live it, to wear it in San Francisco or New York City. It's just remarkable. But it's a combination of authentic Western with all this symbolism of cowboys and stuff. And they're jeans that are stressed, but in an authentic way as opposed to a factory-made way, right? Just nuts. But it's kind of the pinnacle of the identification of denim with the American West continuing throughout the 20th century.
So as we finish up this interview, do you have any final thoughts on jeans in the American experience?
I think in some ways, they've helped keep alive the idea that the West is an important place. In some ways, the West has become more and more like the rest of the country. Interstates, jet travel, national chains like McDonald's or Sears Roebuck. The sort of development of the Cold War, which created an interstate highway system, and partly in the name of defense, but in fact, it helped people get to national parks and get to the West and get to the East and get everywhere more quickly than before. There were lots of forces that were kind of homogenizing the nation in certain ways. But not everyone wanted homogenization. Not everybody wanted the South to be the same as the Northeast. Not everyone wanted the West to be the same as the East. And there were people who wanted it for a variety of reasons, or corporations, other entities, who found value or thought it was appropriate to keep the idea of separate sections alive. And jeans have helped do that. They're not solely a Western product, and a lot of people around in other parts of the country wear them frequently without associating a lot with the American West. So I think they have helped to keep the idea of a separate region alive, but you have to not look at them too closely. You not interrogate them too closely, or not. We have to think about why people outside the West continue wearing them. Sometimes people outside the West want to wear them because they want to associate themselves with the cowboy or the cowgirl. And in some ways, the West still lives on in their imagination, and that's important. And certainly other countries around the world, including Germany in particular, but others too, they have their own traditions of writers who are writing about the West, even in German or Polish or some other language. And they have their own reasons for maintaining some sort of connection to the American cowboy, who really reached his peak and her peak in the 19th century and has been kind of not on life support, but not kind of in the same authentic way living in the 20th century, right? The 20th century jeans become a fashion statement. And that's caught up with the cowboys and their lifestyle. And it's a way of keeping the West distinct, keeping it alive, keeping it different. But jeans aren't just confined to people thinking about the West or living in the West. They have a much larger reach now. And I think they have helped the West persist as a distinct region, but that's not their only service at this point.
Well, thank you so much for meeting with me today and for sharing your expertise with our viewers.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I'm glad you're doing the project. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. For many of us today, the use of candles is often reserved for special occasions. They are what we wish upon for our birthdays, what we light in remembrance of loved ones, what we use for religious ceremonies, or how we decorate a romantic scene. But before the innovation of electric light, candles served an important practical purpose, as well as a ceremonial one. Today, we are going to explore the history of candle making and demonstrate how someone in the 19th century in America would have made them at home. The first documented examples of candle making go back to 3,000 to 5,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. Referred to as rushlights, these candles were made from the pith or core of the rush plant, which was soaked in animal fat. These wickless candles were used by all classes as they were fairly easy to make and did not require costly resources. The first documented wicked candles were created and used by the Romans around 500 BCE. These candles were created by rolling papyrus around a piece of twine and dipping it into animal fat called tallow over and over again until the wax formed around the twine and papyrus. Today, candles often come in a wide array of scents, but the first candles that used tallow were quite stinky due to the smell of burning animal fat, especially if not well refined. But this changed in the Middle Ages when beeswax was found to be smokeless and much better smelling. But beeswax was also very expensive and therefore was reserved for churches and for the wealthy. Tallow candles would continue to be used by the working classes well into the 18th century. Whaling was a huge industry in the 18th century due to the use of whale oil and many other parts of the whale to produce items like soap, hoop skirt, corset, and other structured clothing from whale baleen. Even a substance called ambergris that is used to create perfumes. One other substance was spermaceti, formed in the head cavities of whales. Spermaceti was preferred to tallow and even beeswax because it would stay lighted longer and burn brighter. But like beeswax, it too was reserved for the wealthy. It wasn't until the invention of paraffin wax that scentless candles became accessible to the working classes. In 1830, Karl Reichenbach of Germany created paraffin wax derived from crude oil, coal, or oil shale. It was a new, colorless, odorless, and inexpensive wax that allowed for the mass production of candles. The decline of candles was largely due to the oil lamp and then, of course, the rise of electric light. But they still remained a part of our culture and traditions through their use in special events. And they are always handy when the lights go out at home. We'll now see how someone in the 1800s would make their own candles at home. For this demonstration, I'm going to be using beeswax, but the process would be essentially the same if using tallow. The first step in making candles is, of course, melting your wax. Here I have done that over an open fire that we have built in our open fire pit outside the White Path cabin at the Northeast Georgia History Center. And then I have melted in my metal pot beeswax. The first method of candle making I'll be demonstrating today is mold candles. It's pretty simple. You just pour the melted wax into the mold. So here I am pouring the wax into the molds. And you might notice there's not a wick in the mold. Here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, we do a lot of demonstrations of candle making, especially for our field trips. And the last field trip we had, I didn't get all of the wax out of the candle molds, making it fairly impossible to get the wicks back in. So here I am just going to pour the wax in, hoping that all of the wax will then stick together and come out in one piece so that the molds will be clear again. So trying to make sure that all of the wax sticks together in a candle, even if the candle mold is clear, can be rather difficult. So here I am just trying to make sure that all of the air bubbles are out and all of the wax is being filled up. And that the mold is being full of wax, and that it is also not creating a hole in the center, because that is where one of the problems in candle making with molds comes from, is the wax will adhere to the sides of the mold rather than adhering to the wick, and therefore you pull the wick out and then the wax is still in the mold, and then it's kind of impossible to get out. Now, sometimes wax will run out of the mold, out of the bottom of the mold, if there is not a sufficient enough. You kind of have to pour a little bit of wax in at the first to clog the hole at the end of the candlestick, but sometimes it won't clog it sufficiently and wax will run out of the molds and, well, end up on your table or on your work area. So I don't want to waste any wax, though. Wax is valuable today and back in the 1800s. So after it hardens a little bit, I pull it up and throw it back in the pot. Now I'll be demonstrating the other method of candle making, dip candles. Dip candles, you can see I have a braided linen wick there, and I have tied a washer to the end. I do that for demonstration purposes. They wouldn't have tied a washer back to it in the 1800s. They probably would have tied just a knot in the bottom of the cord or perhaps a rock. Those are two different ideas that have been circulated as to how they would have done this. But you need something heavy because you want to make sure the cord goes all the way down and is straight so that the wax can adhere to it easily. So you can see there's just a little bit of wax adhering to it each time. You then have to let it drip and harden a little bit as you pull it out, because if you put it back in too quickly, it will just melt the wax off. So once you do that repeatedly, well, you start to have a candle form. So the candles, especially with dip candles, when you pull them out, they're very hot. And therefore, if you handle them in a certain way or lay them down flat, you don't want them to dry in that position because, they're very flexible until they've cooled off. So once you've gotten them into the shape that you want, one that will hold up in a candlestick, then you're going to hang them. Gravity will do its work, making sure that they stay nice and straight. And here you can see the 3 stages of candle making. The finished candle, the in-between candle. You could technically call that candle done, but I think it needs a little bit more wax. And then, of course, just the wick with a couple coatings of wax on it. As you can see, it's quite the progression. It's a lot of coats. It's a lot of dunking. The amount of time that it takes to make a dipped candle can vary, really because of the weather. So if you're making a candle in a hotter climate, it's going to take longer because you have to wait between dunks for the wax to cool a little bit more, rather than if you are doing it in the winter or the fall where it's colder outside, the wax is going to set up faster when you pull it out of the vat. When we were making our candles, it took, I'd say about 30 to 45 minutes once the wax was already melted. So that was just the dunking part. And of course, I was just making one as a demonstration. If you were doing this as, say your job or doing this for a household, you would be dunking multiple at a time with either a stick tied along it or a certain type of wooden piece drilled specifically for candle making, because that would just be a waste of time to make one when you could be making multiple at the same time. And now that we're done, it is very important to put out the fire. Fire safety is key. Hello everyone, I am Marie Walker, the director of the Ada Mae Ivester Education Center here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and today I'm going to tell you about the life of Mother Matilda Beasley. Mother Matilda Beasley was born just Matilda Taylor, and she was born into slavery in New Orleans. Well, at least we think she was. It is possible that her mother and her were enslaved, but her early life is very fuzzy on the historical record, but we believe that she was probably born on November 14th, 1832, or it could have been 1834. There are a couple places where records differ, but it was definitely in the 1830s, early 1830s. Her mother's name was Caroline, and she was a French Creole woman who, again, we believe was most likely enslaved. It looks like she was owned by a man named James C. Taylor. And we are unsure who Matilda's father was. Some accounts point to it possibly being James C. Taylor. Matilda did have the last name Taylor until she married, so that could have pointed to James C. Taylor being her father. Other times, enslaved people, when leaving enslavement, did take on the name of their enslaver, the last name of their enslaver, just because they did not have a last name, and therefore they needed one, and that seemed to be a convenient last name to pull from, as it was part of their history, albeit a terrible one. But also, some historians point to Matilda's father being a Native American man that lived within the area, uh, but are not sure necessarily if that is true or not. So it also is unclear what Matilda or Caroline's roles while enslaved were. They could have been enslaved on a plantation or in an urban area of New Orleans. But some historians also speculate that Matilda became an orphan at an early age, and she might have spent some time at a Catholic orphanage in New Orleans. Now, another very interesting thing that I am most generally intrigued by that we do not have answers for is how or why she obtained her freedom from enslavement, if she was indeed enslaved, which it looks like she was. And that's really an interesting thing because we are not sure why, but it seems like she either bought her own freedom or she was gifted her freedom. We aren't sure how or why she obtained her freedom, but we do know that she made her way to Savannah, Georgia in the 1850s. And since she went from New Orleans to Savannah, Georgia, those are two places in the South where slavery was indeed legal, that points to her not being a runaway or self-liberated enslaved person. Instead, it suggests that she purchased or was gifted her freedom. She was a free person living in the South, a free person of color living in the South. And we know that for sure. So that's one indication of that she was either purchased her freedom or was gifted it. So as she went to go live in Savannah, there was also a population of 705 free people of color in Savannah listed in the 1860s census. So we can assume that in the 1850s, it's about that same number of people as well. So these free persons of color, they were forced to actually wear identifying badges to say that they were indeed free people of color. Free women and men of color did a lot of jobs, a lot of different trade jobs that were often equated to what poor white people would have done at the same time. So Matilda Beasley, as a free woman of color, would have done a lot of the same things as a poor white woman would have done. And that would have been like a laundress or a seamstress, domestic help, and cooks. And in the 1860 census, Matilda Beasley is listed as working as a seamstress. So that is what she did to make her living. She was a seamstress. So this is a skill. Sewing is a skill, which points to her having learned that probably back in New Orleans, that she would have learned how to sew. Generally, that is something that not a enslaved field hand would have learned how to do. So that points to her probably working within a house context. Now, what I think is most interesting here is she ran a secret school for free and enslaved Black children. If she ran a school teaching people how to read and write, that means that she herself had to learn how to read and write. And I'm interested to see who taught her, who taught Matilda how to read and write, because that was illegal. But in New Orleans, the rules, they have a little bit of a different bend on them because of the French and Spanish colonization before America took control in the early 1800s with the Louisiana Purchase. And the rules about slavery from Spain and from France were different than rules that English colonies had and America had about enslavement, which is just, it is a very interesting social constructs that they have about that. But while we do not know who taught Matilda how to read and write or where she received her education, we do know that from the 1850s to 1860s, she taught at a secret school from the 1850s to 1860s, where she taught free and enslaved Black children to read and write at a time where it was illegal to do so. She could have gotten in trouble. And it was not just illegal for a Black woman or a Black man to teach Black children. It was also illegal for a white teacher to teach Black children at that time. So she could have definitely been punished if the wrong people were to have found out about the secret school that she was having in her home. And that punishment for Black teachers who were teaching Black enslaved children or even Black free children at the time to read and write was a fine of $100 and up to 32 lashes with a whip in the public square. Now, white teachers, for doing the same offense, they would have just had to pay a fine of $500 and there would have been no chance of whippings. That was not something that was on the table for white educators. But the education of these children that Matilda Beasley participated in, these quote unquote secret schools, they were more or less an open secret. It would be probably a good way to describe these schools. It looks like there might have been 6 or 7 of these illegal schools for enslaved children in the 1860s in Savannah. And of course, we are not super sure because they were an open secret, meaning that people knew about them, but you still don't want to have documentation of it. And teachers and students still had to take precautions. So students, they would hide their books on their way to school. They would wrap them in newspapers so people didn't see them as they were walking to school, or they would hide their books in baskets and then cover them with fuel chips. Some students, they also had to change their routes to and from school, so it didn't look like all of these children were just going to this one person's house every single day. These secret schools also often had hiding places in them just in case they were raided by authorities. So we do not know much more about Matilda Beasley's work within the secret school context, other than we know that it did occur. So not only was she a teacher and a seamstress, she also worked at a restaurant on Bryan Street in Savannah. And we know that she worked at this restaurant because her name was listed in an ad for this restaurant in 1865. The restaurant was called Railroad House, and this restaurant at which she worked was owned by a man named Abraham Beasley, who was a wealthy, free Black man in Savannah. As well as owning this restaurant, he also owned land, a produce market, and a saloon, as well as a boarding house. So this is a man of some means. But he didn't just earn his money from all of these businesses that he ran. He also earned some of his money from the slave trade, which is a very interesting, complex thing to look at because he is a free Black man who is also participating in the slave trade. It does not look like he himself owned slaves or owned enslaved individuals, but he definitely earned some of his money in the slave trade. There's lots of different ways that businesses were affected by the slave trade. We are not necessarily sure exactly how he participated, but it does seem to be that he did indeed get some of this money that he then used to open these different businesses from participating in some part of the slave trade. Now we can assume that Matilda met Abraham Beasley when she was working at his restaurant, and then we can assume that they fell in love because soon after we see her starting to work at this restaurant, they married. So in 1869, Matilda, at this time she's still Matilda Taylor, she was baptized at St. John the Baptist Cathedral. And this was probably in preparation for her marriage to Abraham Beasley because they were then married on February 9th, 1869. Matilda and Abraham Beasley then lived at a house on 48 Harris Street, and they did not have any children of their own, but Abraham, he had a son who was also named Abraham from a previous marriage, his first marriage. So they did have a son that was living with them at the time, but it was not one that was produced from their union. Matilda and Abraham remained married until Abraham's death on September 3rd, 1877, and he was then buried in Savannah's Catholic Cemetery on Wheaton Street. Abraham left all of his money, property, and businesses to Matilda, so she became a very wealthy widow, but she didn't want to keep the money. She turned around and donated all of her wealth to the Roman Catholic Church. Some historians theorize that she possibly donated this wealth to the church as a way to atone for her husband's sins of making this money that was then used to make even more money from the slave trade. But there is no documents that point specifically to that. That is just very much a historian's theory, which seems rather plausible. So, no, we are not exactly sure how Matilda first became a Catholic, because at this point in her life, once her husband dies and she donates all of her money to the Catholic Church, she becomes incredibly invested in the Catholic Church. So there are lots of different theories about how she came to the Catholic faith. One is that she is from New Orleans, which is a city that has a very strong influence of French and Spanish Catholicism from the time the time when it was colonized by the French and the Spanish. So it's a city in the South, which is a rather rare thing, that has a very, very strong ties to the Catholic Church rather than Protestant or Anglican ties. She was probably always aware of Catholicism, but we don't know when she necessarily accepted that faith or when she learned about it and decided to follow it herself. So she could have acquired it at a young age. The family that owned her and her mother could have been Catholics and therefore encouraged the Catholic faith to those that they had enslaved. She could have also spent time at a Catholic orphanage after her mother's death. That's another theory about when she possibly came to learn more about the Catholic faith. But from what documents that we have point to, it looks like she became a Catholic at the time when she married Abraham Beasley, because that's the time when she was baptized into the Catholic Church before she was married in the Catholic Church to Abraham. So it looks like Abraham himself indeed was Catholic, wanted to have a Catholic wedding and Catholic marriage because that's a sacrament within the Catholic Church. So therefore had his wife not necessarily convert, but at least baptize and express that she accepted that faith so that they could then be married. But regardless of how she came to the Catholic faith, it is very obvious that from the point of her husband's death onward, and probably even before her husband's death, I really think it happened at the time when she married Abraham, it looks like she very much at that point wholeheartedly embraced her Catholic faith and very much dedicated her life to serving the church. And I mean, she gave the Roman Catholic Church all of her money that she had inherited upon her husband's death. That's a pretty big commitment, an act of service to the church. But she didn't just give the money without any stipulations. She had specific requests, and basically what she had requested was that part of the funds be used for a home for African American orphans within Savannah. And this is also at the time, at her husband's death, that she decided to become a nun. And in 1885, Matilda entered a Franciscan nunnery in York, England, and that's where she began to train as a novice. And we aren't exactly sure why she decided to go all the way to York, England. One theory is that in the November of 1884, there was a group of Franciscan nuns who arrived in Savannah to work with the African Americans on Skidaway Island. And these nuns were from an order called the Poor Clares, which is the second order of the Franciscan orders. And it looks like one of the nuns that was a part of this group that had come to Savannah had been a member of that order in York. We also know that Matilda's husband Abraham owned property on Skidaway Island. That was one of his holdings. And we know from correspondence that Matilda had spent time on that property on Skidaway Island. So while we do not have evidence that Matilda met these nuns, we do have circumstantial evidence that points to where they could have been at the same place at the same time and therefore could have met. And for someone who wants to be a nun and then decide to go to this very specific place in York, England to do that, it seems like it's a rather perhaps in our historian's view obvious that she met with this nun and then they had developed some type of friendship, so that then she went to this nunnery in York, England, to where she then took her vows to become a nun. And that is indeed, we aren't sure how she necessarily decided to go to York, but we do know that she went to York, she trained to become a nun, and then she took her vows to become a nun while in York, but she did not stay in York, England. Instead, she returned to Savannah after taking her vows as a nun, and then she helped establish that orphanage for African American children that she had requested some of the funds from her husband's estate go towards. So this orphanage for African American children that she comes back and helps establish was located near the 31st and 32nd Streets and near Habersham Street as well. The street names and numbers in Savannah have changed since the 1800s, so trying to go back and locate some things exactly is rather difficult. But we do know that the orphanage was named St. Francis Home for Colored Orphans. And the first orphans arrived at this orphanage in the spring of 1887. And this is another interesting feature of the orphanage, was not only was it the first home for African American children in Savannah, well, first orphanage home for African American children in Savannah, but this orphanage was specifically to serve Black girls. Now, in 1889, Matilda formed the first community of African American nuns in Georgia. Now, I keep saying the word Franciscan, so some people might be wondering exactly what that is. So, members of the Franciscan order are members of an order or any order founded in the early 13th century by St. Francis of Assisi, one of the early saints in the Catholic Church. And members of the Franciscan orders, they strive to promote the values of poverty and charity, therefore serving their community and not taking anything from their community, just to serve their community. They hate vows of poverty, so therefore they do not try to earn anything from their good works. And it's at this time when Matilda begins to really form this community of African American nuns in Georgia that she gets the title Mother Matilda and then Mother Beasley, and Mother being a title generally given to a senior nun in order. So as she sets up this order, she is the senior nun, therefore she gets the title of Mother. And this group that she sets up, they then go on to operate the orphanage for several years, but the orphanage, it was constantly underfunded and understaffed. So in 1895, there were actually even several attempts to burn the orphanage down. And it's not sure who attempted to start the fires. Some blame a few teenage girls who were living at the orphanage, but that was just one of the rather large issues that this orphanage was facing. Mother Matilda Beasley, of course, was doing her best, but the orphanage was facing a lot of problems. And in the late 1890s, the orphanage actually had to move locations to East Broad Street. The orphanage then shared the site with St. Benedict's Parish Church, and both the church and the orphanage were very much of service to the African American population in Savannah, and pretty much entirely just served the African American community. But of course, we're almost to the turn of the last century here. Mother Matilda Beasley was very much growing older, and she needed much more help running the orphanage. So in 1898, 3 Franciscan sisters came to help her, and this is when Mother Matilda's original group of African American nuns disbanded. And then when these other Franciscan sisters came to really take over the orphanage, because Mother Matilda Beasley was just really reaching an age where she could no longer healthily run it herself, she then moved out of the orphanage and really kind of enjoyed a type of retirement. Of course, she did not stop serving her community. She just had to kind of take a step back because she was getting rather old. So as Mother Matilda moved out of the orphanage, she then moved into this cottage that the Sacred Heart Church gave her that was located at 1511 Price Street. And it was in this cottage where she continued to work at the orphanage. She was just no longer running it, so it was not as stressful. And then she would also take in sewing, very much going back to her roots in her early days of working in Savannah, of being a seamstress. And she would take in this sewing work, and then she would give the money that she earned from her sewing to those in need and to the orphanage. And she did this until her death. She died on December 20th, 1903, and it was reported that she was engaged in devotions in her private chapel in her cottage at the time of her death. And it looks very much like she knew that her time was coming, that she knew it was time for her to depart this world, because when her body was found, located next to it were her burial clothes, her will, and instructions for her funeral. There were many people of different backgrounds who attended her funeral mass. There were Protestants and Catholics, blacks and whites, all coming together to honor this woman. The Savannah Morning News reported that there were actually no available seats in the entire church for the service, and she actually had requested that no one eulogize her during her funeral mass. That it was just to be another mass in which it was her funeral, but she was not to be eulogized. She didn't want people to talk about her good works at that time during the mass. But the newspapers, well, she said nothing about being eulogized in the newspaper. So the Savannah Morning News wrote a beautiful article about her, and I'm going to quote a part of that now, which says, "Protestants speak in the highest terms of her life and character, and among the Negroes the feeling prevails that they have lost their truest friend and benefactor." So the community mourned her loss, and she was honored in the press. Another newspaper went on to call her the idol of the poor, especially among the Negroes. She was just held in such high esteem. And then after her funeral, she was laid to rest at Savannah's Catholic Cemetery on Wheaton Street, the same one that her husband was buried in. Mother Matilda Beasley's legacy continues to this day. The Sacred Heart Church established the Mother Matilda Beasley Society in her honor, which promotes charitable programs and also raises awareness of African American contributions to the Roman Catholic Church. Mother Matilda Beasley's home, where she spent her final days, and was that cottage that was given to her by the Sacred Heart Church, has been preserved and is actually being worked on to be made into a museum with panels, so that people can kind of use that space to better understand her life. And but that's not all. The city of Savannah also dedicated a park in memory of Mother Matilda in 1982. And this park includes basketball courts, a baseball field, and playgrounds for the community to enjoy. There's also a historical marker which recounts her many accomplishments. And then in 2004, she was inducted into the Georgia Women's Hall of Fame for being the amazing woman that she is. I really hope you enjoyed this program about this remarkable woman who does not have perhaps as much written about her and as much praise given to her as perhaps she deserves, but perhaps that's how she wants it, given that her final instructions were not to eulogize her, but to really have her actions point to the higher power that she served. But in this documentary, we still want to highlight her accomplishments and what she did, and perhaps in that way still honor her and her wishes by showing what she did for others. So we honor Mother Matilda Beasley during this program as we look at her incredible life and try to get her story out there more, because she was a really remarkable woman. So thank you so much for watching this program. We hope that you enjoyed learning more about Georgia's own history and some of its Catholic history as well. And thank you so much for being a member of the Northeast Georgia History Center. We truly appreciate it. And until next time, take care.
Pottery has been produced in the southeast United States for thousands of years, long before white Europeans arrived in the area. Native Americans made their own pottery not only for storage, but also for tasks such as cooking over direct or indirect heat. However, when Europeans arrived in the area and began to expand their colonies into what is now the United States, the Native Americans were pushed west. Since the beginning of the 19th century, the majority of potters in the area have been African Americans. They have been folk potters, meaning they were not professionally trained at an art school, and their pottery has been used for storage, but not for cooking. Folk pottery has been an important part of the United States economy since the 19th century, when plantation owners would require their slaves to produce pottery for sale. Pottery was one of several crafts with which plantation owners would supplement their income during the off-season for crops, alongside quilting and carpentry. The pottery is made from clay, which was gathered by hand. The clay is coiled like a snake and then shaped into a cylinder. The pot is then spun on a potting wheel while the potter smooths and shapes it. Next, the pottery is glazed. Traditionally, lead glazes were used, although alkaline and salt are now more common. This gives the jug its shiny appearance. If there was decoration on the vessel, it was drawn on with slip, which is a glaze made with various materials or oxides in order to give it a different color. Finally, the jug is fired in a kiln. Traditionally, the kiln was wood-fired, but electric kilns are also used today. The lion's share of pottery from 19th century America comes from the Edgefield district of South Carolina, a region which covers modern-day Edgefield, Aiken, and Greenwood counties. Most of the pottery from this period and region is unsigned, as slaves were not permitted to read or write, so we don't know for sure the names of the people who made it. Most pottery of this time is purely utilitarian, which means it is not decorative and was only meant to be used in the home or on the farm for storage. There are exceptions to both of these. One artist whose name we do know is David Drake, otherwise known as Dave Pottery or Dave the Potter. Drake inscribed his name into his works, usually along with brief rhyming couplets. Some of these couplets even described the work. For example, this work is named Great and Noble Jar and bears the inscription, Great and Noble Jar, hold sheep, goat, and bear. Other pieces of pottery contain dates and rhymes such as, the 4th of July is surely to come, to blow the fife and beat the drum. Still, others contained rhymes having to do with his enslavement and his feelings of separation from his people. I wander where is all my relations, friendship to all and every nation. It is unclear how Drake learned how to read and write, as teaching a slave to read and write in South Carolina was punishable by a fine of 100 pounds and up to 6 months in prison. Yet, there are some accounts of slaves learning to read and write either in secret or, in even more rare situations, with permission from their enslaver. Drake was a slave born in about 1800. He was country-born, meaning he was born in America rather than brought over from Africa. He was enslaved by Harvey Drake, who owned a large pottery business. When Harvey Drake died, David Drake was enslaved by Reverend John Landrum and was purchased by his son upon Landrum's death. His treatment under the sun was poor, and he produced no pottery during this time. In 1849, Drake was then purchased and enslaved by a white factory owner named Lewis Miles. It was at this time that he produced his largest amount of pottery. He worked at Miles' factory, which was called Stony Bluff. When he was freed at the end of the Civil War, he took the surname Drake from his first owner and continued making pottery. He appears in the 1870 census as David Drake Turner, but does not appear in the 1880 census, indicating that he died sometime in the 1870s. It is surprising that Drake took the time to inscribe his work, partially due to the fact that it was illegal for him to be literate, and partially due to the fact that it would have taken him extra time to make the pot. Potters were advised to spend as little time as possible on each pot. Floyd Hilton, a man who mentored some of the last utilitarian potters in North Carolina, was quoted by one of his students as saying, "Don't make any difference. Just so they hold what they're supposed to and got a good glaze on it, people's gonna set them in the smokehouse or cellar and nobody'll ever see them anyway." This was good advice. The slaves were required to produce as many pieces as possible, and taking the time for embellishment wouldn't result in any extra privileges. In fact, it could result in punishment if their owner decided they were taking too long. Inscriptions weren't the only things Drake took extra time on, however. This is a face pot, a type of pottery frequently produced by African Americans in the 19th century especially. Most face pots were not produced during the day. They were made in the evenings or at nights on the slaves' own free time. This is because they were often used by the slaves rather than sold for a profit, and because the extra time needed to make these pots would result in less production, which the slaves would have been punished for. Dave the Potter experimented with this, but he was far from the only one. Most 19th century face jugs were made at Thomas Davis Palmetto Fire Brick Works in the Edgefield district of South Carolina. The base of the jug is made the same way as an undecorated pot, by coiling and smoothing with hands. The features of the face are made by pinching the clay into shapes before firing. Often the eyes are made separately and then pressed into the sockets. The ears were sometimes made by pinching and sometimes added on afterwards. They usually served as handles. Colored eyes and teeth were made by using a different glaze on those features, though sometimes they were also left unglazed. There are many possible reasons why slaves would make these jugs. One theory is that they are related to Nigeria's younger ancestral jars, which were made to contain the spirits of ancestors. Although the slaves may not have made them specifically to contain ancestral spirits, they may still have had spiritual significance. They may have contained good luck or lucky spirits, based on the fact that many broken jugs have been found along the Underground Railroad. The jugs may have been deliberately broken when luck or aid was needed. Other potential sources of inspiration include the white potter from the same region, Thomas Chandler, who began his work around the same time as the African Americans in Edgefield did. Toby jugs were frequently made in England since the 1760s, about 100 years before the African Americans in the Edgefield district started carving out this niche for themselves. Face jugs still have some popularity today, largely thanks to one family which started making pottery in the late 19th century. The Meters family is relatively late to the face jug game, beginning in 1892 when John Milton Meters founded the Meters Folk Pottery operation. He worked alongside his son Wiley, Calder, Cleater, Casey, Lewis Quillen, and Cheever, in addition to two hired, experienced potters, Marion Davidson and Williams Dorsey. In 1920, his youngest son, Cheever Meters, took over the family business. At this time, there was a decline in the demand for food-related farmware as more and more people moved out of agriculture into cities. Cheever found that his main customers instead were crafts enthusiasts. This is due to an increased interest in arts and crafts as part of home decor. It became a trend to have handmade items in one's home, such as Southern folk pottery or Navajo blankets. This interior decorating movement was a response to the increased mechanization of production and the loss of individuality in mass-produced items. In 1967, Cheever became too ill to continue the family business, so his son, Quillen Lanier Meters, took over. Lanier had not been active in the family business until this point. However, he was able to revitalize it, keeping the tradition alive today. Lanier brought back the tradition of face jugs and pots, and his fame is largely based on these. In 1983, he was awarded a National Heritage Fellowship by the National Endowment for the Arts. Lanier passed away in 1998, but his success has inspired others to continue the family tradition, including his brother Edwin and his cousin Cleator Jr. Today, his work is in museums across the country, including here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, as well as the Folk Pottery Museum of Northeast Georgia, the Atlanta History Center, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Smithsonian. Another form of African American pottery was the memory jug, also known as a mourning vessel, a forget-me-not jug, or a spirit jar. These were vessels covered with a malleable, adhesive substance such as plaster or putty, and then covered with shells, buttons, pottery sherds, and other trinkets. This is an older form of pottery than the face jug, with the earliest pieces from the 1800s and the latest from the first half of the 20th century. Historians have reached no definitive conclusions about their purpose, but there are some theories based on certain African practices. One African and African American funerary tradition is to place vessels which are often cracked or broken on graves and gravesites, which is where many of these jugs have been found. Therefore, some speculate that these jugs were used either as grave markers or as grave decoration. Grave decoration in West and Central Africa was considered a way to both commemorate the dead and link the spiritual world with the physical. Glass, beads, mirrors, and other reflective materials referenced the watery realm where the spirits reside, and the use of these and similar materials on memory jugs may indicate a connection between the jugs and the ancient African practice. However, despite the strong correlation between the African funerary tradition and the creation and use of the jugs, no concrete evidence has been found supporting the idea that these jugs were used as grave markers. Another possible meaning behind the jugs is their use as mnemonic devices. The trinkets on the surface could have served as reminders of particular stories for the viewer. This theory also can be traced back to Africa. The Luba people of Southeast Zaire made lukasa, or memory boards, which are very similar in both function and design. A final theory for the jugs is that they are based in a Victorian craft tradition, originally practiced by well-to-do women. Whatnot, or whimsy jars, were made for the sake of making something. They were made as a sort of three-dimensional scrapbook, which both prevented the waste from throwing out other craft items and allowed the maker to express herself artistically. However, most antebellum Southern folk pottery was undecorated. The goal was to produce the pottery as quickly as possible, so that it would hold what was needed and nothing else. Potters who did spend more time making their pottery higher quality often ended up earning less money if they were free and could be punished if they were enslaved. The most decoration that can be found on pots before the 20th century is a difference in color, created by using iron, manganese, and copper oxides. However, some pots did have designs on them. The Bell family in the Shenandoah Valley painted on geometric designs, and several potters in Virginia sponged or splattered different colors in random patterns. By the early 19th century, potters and consumers were beginning to realize that the lead glaze that had been used traditionally was toxic. Some potters, mainly in Virginia, switched to salt or alkaline glazes. Other potters switched to a different form of pottery, stoneware rather than earthenware. It was the potters who switched to alkaline glazes who had the easiest time with decoration, which is why some of the most decorated pottery originated in the Edgefield district of South Carolina. Another reason why these potters had the easiest time with decoration is because the clay of that region is light burning and has high kaolin content. Although clay is an ideal medium for sculptors, three-dimensional ornamentation, meaning figures which were molded onto the pot, such as this bunch of grapes, was rare. One of the main exceptions to this was the earthenware potters of the Shenandoah Valley, who were skilled in making molds of animals, fish, birds, flowers, and even human figures, which they could then apply to the surface of their vessels. Pottery in the southern United States may have its roots in African traditions, such as with the face jugs and the memory jars. It also has roots in the oppression and enslavement of African Americans who were forced to make these pots in order to survive. However, despite the poor circumstances the potters found themselves in, they were able to make many beautiful works, many of which still survive today. Furthermore, folk pottery is not a dead tradition. There are several potters still in operation today, making works for sale just as they did 200 years ago. If you live near the History Center, we hope you'll visit our Folk Arts Gallery to see examples of folk pottery for yourself. As always, thank you for being a member of the Northeast Georgia History Center. Let us know your thoughts on today's program or any questions you may have in the comments below.
Since humans harnessed fire for warmth and cooking thousands of years ago, fire has offered enormous benefits and enormous risk. While today we have a multitude of methods to prevent fires, when one happens, most towns and cities have a dedicated team to call, the fire department. Today we are going to explore the history and evolution of the fire department from its ancient beginnings. We'll look at the rise of fire extinguishing inventions, the early versions of the fire truck, and speak with local firefighters of Gainesville, Georgia. The oldest fire extinguisher is perhaps the humble bucket, which was put to good use by bucket brigades in ancient Egypt, Rome, Mesopotamia, and other large urban societies. It would literally take a village to control a fire. Watchmen would be posted to survey the area for fire and crime, and should a fire break out, the watchman would sound an alarm, and other watchmen and community members would form a line from a water source and pass buckets of water to throw onto the fire. Marcus Crassus, a wealthy Roman in the early 1st century CE, saw structural fires as a financial opportunity. Should a home or building be on fire, he would offer to purchase the burning structure for a low price, and only after the owner accepted this offer would he have his team of slaves put out the fire. Other wealthy Romans would follow suit by creating their own personal team of firefighting slaves to protect their property. The first public fire brigade was under Roman Emperor Augustus in 6 AD, who was inspired by the wealthy's personal firefighters. These firefighters were called vigiles, and were comprised of 6,000 slaves who were the watchmen of Rome's urban centers. For this, they would be granted full citizenship after 6 years serving as vigiles. Over time, the vigiles would expand into a military unit of freedmen rather than slaves. It's during this time, still in the early 1st century, that we see firefighting equipment in regular use. The vigiles used hand-operated water pumps to propel water. Hooks, axes, ladders, and other tools were used to bring down a building so that the fire could then be smothered with wet quilted blankets. The watchman method of spotting and controlling a fire would be the norm for most cities well into the 17th century. Private firefighting teams would continue to be employed by the wealthy, and eventually insurance companies would form their own brigades to protect their clients' homes. Key inventions for firefighting were created and greatly improved in the 1600s. Hans Hausch of Germany improved the hand-operated water pump to propel water even further. Dutch inventor Jan van der Heyden invented the fire hose by using a flexible leather connected by brass fittings. In 1725, British inventor Richard Newsham created a cart with water pumps that could propel water up to 40 meters. The first fire department in what would become the United States was created by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia in 1736. Benjamin Franklin also invented the fire-preventing lightning rod for homes. Named the Union Fire Company, this volunteer fire company used tools and methods similar to the ancient Roman vigiles, such as buckets, fire poles, ladders, and water pumps. Like ancient Rome, residents were expected to have buckets at the ready in their homes should a fire break out, though these buckets were usually made of leather. The most innovative piece of equipment at this time was the fire engine, which was on wheels and manually powered by hand. Water was dumped into a reservoir by a bucket brigade, and the engine's water pump would propel water upward through a pipe. Improvements were made to the fire engine to increase its water capacity and the distance of water propulsion, as well as a hose to direct water flow to specific areas. The early fire engines were small enough for 4 men to carry or drag to a fire. Fire engines would increase in size and include wheels to be hauled by horses, which significantly improved response time to fire. In 1822, another great improvement to the fire engine was the ability to draft water from a source rather than rely on bucket brigades to continually fill the engine's reservoir. Another way that water could be procured is by digging a hole to create a wet well, which had to be filled and plugged after use. This was also called a fire plug, which is still a common term for today's fire hydrant. The above-ground fire hydrant we see today were most likely first invented in 1801 by Frederick Graff, who was the chief engineer of the Philadelphia Waterworks. We say likely invented because, ironically, his patent was destroyed during a fire at the U.S. Patent Office in 1836. The advancements of municipal water systems increased the number of fire hydrants available in a city and made the reaction time to a fire much quicker. Another advancement, developed in 1841, was the aerial ladder that could extend to 85 feet in height, allowing a better vantage point to direct water onto the fire. The use of trained horses and a dog became common in fire brigades as the fire engines became too heavy to haul with manpower. The horses and a dog would be trained to recognize the sound of the alarm bell. The dog would basically herd the horses to their designated places in front of the fire engine. Oftentimes, the dog was a Dalmatian because this breed of dog forms a strong bond with horses and they are highly intelligent. The dog would even run ahead of the fire engine toward the fire by listening to the whistle commands of the firemen to know which direction to go. Seeing a Dalmatian running down the street signaled that the fire engine would be passing through soon so people would know to clear the roads. By the 1840s, self-propelled steam-powered fire engines would increase the range of water propulsion so firefighters could keep a safe distance, but the internal combustion engine would eventually replace horse-powered and most steam-powered fire engines by the 1920s. Gasoline-powered fire trucks featured ladders that were attached to the truck itself and could be lowered and raised. This was especially needed as structures were built higher and higher. By the 1950s, fire trucks were equipped with two-way radios, breathing apparatuses, and fire retardant suits. Government-run fire departments would not appear in the United States until the mid-1800s. Most fire brigades were privately operated by insurance companies or volunteers in the community. But in 1865, just after the Civil War, the United States government established the first government-run fire departments. The growing population, businesses, and larger buildings in urban cities made a public fire department a necessity to protect people and property. Here in Gainesville, Georgia, where the History Center is located, the first volunteer fire brigade, called the Hook and Ladder Company, was formed in 1876, equipped only with a small hook and ladder wagon. By 1879, the city purchased a hand engine and reorganized the company into the Protection Fire Company No. 1. City Council meeting minutes indicate that the hook and ladder company was then turned over to a complement of 15 black men who would also assist in fire control. A steam engine was requested in 1886, and shortly after, a Silsby steam fire engine was purchased, as well as 1,000 feet of hose and one hose cart. By 1888, there were 3 fire companies in Gainesville with a total of 85 men, and they were referred to collectively as the Gainesville Fire Department. In 1898, opinions on the building of a new city hall and firehouse were voiced in the Gainesville Eagle. The only source of protection to our houses and property is our fire engine and equipment. It is housed now in an old wooden building that is actually falling in from decay. It is a building in which, if the fatal spark were dropped, the flames would spread with irresistible fury, destroying or disabling the fire apparatus in an inconceivably short time, and going without let or hindrance where the winds might carry it. A year later, in 1899, a new city hall and fire department were built and became a point of pride to Gainesville citizens. The fire department, which has greatly improved during the year, is now the pride of our city. We have now a partially paid department with 2 well-trained horses, which responds promptly at every call, and our citizens feel more secure for their lives and property when they retire at night. Reports from the Gainesville Fire Department to the City Council provide some insight as to the common causes of fire, which included defective chimney flues, gas stoves, hot ashes from fires escaping to the floor, oil lamps catching curtains on fire, and grass catching on fire. In 1916, Gainesville's first motorized fire engine was purchased and equipped with an 800-gallon-per-minute pump and 1,500 feet of fire hose. This fire engine would later be used during the disastrous Hunt Opera House fire in 1925, which also brought in firemen from Atlanta and surrounding towns. A little over a decade later, in 1936, a devastating super tornado ripped through downtown Gainesville, causing fires throughout the city and an especially dangerous fire at the local Cooper Pants factory. Gainesville's second fire truck, known as the Leapin' Lena, was used during the 1936 fires. Today, the Leapin' Lena is on display at the Inc. Children's Museum in Gainesville. Now, we've used the terms fire engine and fire truck so far, and there is a difference. A fire truck has a water tank and is typically the first to arrive at a fire. A fire truck is used for the transport of the firemen, safety and rescue equipment, and it has the attached expandable ladder. Today, there are various types of fire engines and fire trucks suited for specific purposes such as wildfire, challenging terrains, swift water rescues, and areas with hazardous materials. The most recognizable fire truck today is the Type 1 fire truck, which are designed to serve urban, rural, and suburban areas. This truck is also an engine, as it has a pump with a tank size of at least 300 gallons. To learn more about the fire department's role in the community and what it's like to be a firefighter, we had the pleasure of speaking with Chief Brandon Ellis and Division Chief Keith Smith from Gainesville Fire Station 1.
My name is Brandon Ellis. I'm the Fire Chief for Gainesville Fire Department. So, I actually grew up, 2 of my good friends, their dads both were captains within the fire service. One worked for Hall County, one worked for Gainesville. And so I grew up kind of around the fire station, you know, on the weekends going and hanging out with their dads during the summer. And so when I started college after high school, I spent about a year and a half in there and realized that it wasn't for me right then. So one of my friend's dads actually reached out and said, hey, why don't you apply at the fire department, we can get you a job. So I applied for both Gainesville and Hall County. Hall County was hiring first, so I got a job with them. I spent right at 3 years with Hall County, and then my other friend's dad actually called me up and said, hey, we're fixing to hire at Gainesville. I'd love for you to come over. So I put an application here and got hired here, and that was 18 years ago, and I started out. I didn't really have any desire to be fire chief. I thought, I'd love to be, either a training officer or a battalion chief on shift. I enjoyed doing training and that kind of thing. And then this past year, when our former fire chief, Jerome Yarbo, announced his retirement, I just kind of thought about it, and I had a bunch of friends and coworkers say, hey, why don't you put in, just try it. And so I put in and went through the process, and I was kind of shocked when I got the phone call. Personality is a big thing.
I know a lot of people say that we see stuff that you normally wouldn't see, and we do, but it's kind of on a, it's not like you see it every day. It's, you know, if we run 10 calls, one of them might be bad, the other 9 are just random. You know, somebody's grandmother fell and we're just helping them up. You know, somebody's got a stomach ache, we're loading them up, taking them to the hospital. But attitude is really the big thing because it's kind of like a fraternity here. We only have one female on shift right now. We did have 2, and the other female, she's actually left. She went to Colorado to do wildland firefighting. But you spend a third of your life basically with these guys in a fire station, and it's 24 hours a day. Then you're off for 48, so you get a real strong bond with these guys. But it's kind of like they're your brother almost. So you learn to like them and you learn to hate them at the same time. So it's all about attitude, how well you can get along with people, because you're there with them a tenth of your life. You know, for 10 years straight. If you do 30 years, you're here for 10 years basically. So that's a long time to be with the same guys day in and day out. But I've actually gotten to witness it this last couple of years where we've had some tragedies within the fire service. And the brotherhood bond here is enormous. I mean, it's when people are hurting, people step up tremendously to help out. They'll give time, give money, just whatever. So it's, the attitude is the biggest thing for being a firefighter, I would say. It's just being able to connect with other people. You know, everybody says, oh, firefighters, you know, you got to be physically in shape. Our job's physically demanding, but we all love to eat, so we're not the best in shape. But we do get out. We all, you know, we'll play basketball, we'll put gear on, do workouts together, but we love to eat. So,
Yeah.
you know, we may have a good workout in the engine bay, and then we cook a big, huge meal. We sit down and kind of have a good time. So we actually, as far as Gainesville Fire, we don't do transport, but we do EMS also. So not only we do just your run of the mill, you know, somebody's got a stomach ache or they've got the flu. COVID was a big thing for us. We were constantly, while everybody else was stuck in their home, and you know, if we get within 10 feet of somebody, when they were sick, they were calling us to actually go out there, give them oxygen, load them up, take them to the hospital. So we experienced that firsthand. Of course, your car wrecks where people are trapped, we have to cut them out. Your house fires, we've had a few fires that in my time have been memorable. We had a chemical warehouse catch on fire, and so it was, I mean, you had stuff explode, you had chemicals mixing that turned into almost like an acid, just eating stuff. So that was very memorable. We had the plant last 2 years ago, I believe, where the nitrogen leak caused a tragedy. We were on duty that day, so that was big. We had a lot of debriefing going on because people saw stuff they've never seen before. We actually, myself and a lot of our administrative staff, and then the shift that got off this morning, we all went to the recent rescue in White County Friday night where the hiker fell and got trapped. We got to participate in that and help out with some neighboring departments. So as far as what we get to see and do, the Gainesville Fire Department, we're actually trained in about any area of rescue you can be trained in because we're the host for the Georgia Task Force Team, Team 1 for GSAR. So we respond district-wide for about anything you can think of. It makes it interesting here because you can kind of come here to work and there's a chance you're going to get to see anything that you possibly could. The biggest thing is a lot of times we'll have, you know, anywhere from a small child to a teenager will come up and say, you may not remember, but one day you guys came and did this. And it's touching because we don't expect a pat on the back. We don't expect praise. That's just not who we are. But it does kind of humble you when you have somebody from the community come up, they give you a hug, or they bring you food or cookies or whatever, and they say, you helped my grandmother out, you helped my mom, my dad, my brother, my sister, my child. It's a humbling experience, it really is. Well, the city of Gainesville is growing fast. I mean, it's getting huge. And so, for me, I'd love to see the department grow with it. I'd love for us to double in size. But my main goal, honestly, and all the shift guys, we've kind of been talking about it, is we would love to see the name of the Gainesville Fire Department be not just statewide, but be nationally known, because we have some of the best people here working, some of the highest trained people. I would love for our name to get out there to the point where when people say, hey, we heard about Gainesville Fire went out and did this with this other department, they know who we are because we're that good. That's what I really love. The big thing that I've been making a push on is because we're taxpayer funded, I want people to realize that it's not a closed door building. I mean, it's their tax dollars are paying for this. So we're making a huge push publicly to take the fire trucks out, show the community. I want the community to know that they can come into the fire station, bring their kids in, and look at the trucks. We actually had a family come in last week. We set the ladder truck up in the back of the station, and we let them get in the bucket of the ladder truck. We took them up and kind of showed the kids around. And I just want them to understand that it's a community, and we're part of that community, and they have a right to come in and ask questions and see and interact with us, because the more that the community understands we're here for them, I think the more they're going to understand what we really do and what we need to be able to proceed and progress in the future. So that's my big thing right now, is I want the community to know that we are a part of it.
My name is Keith Smith, and I'm with the Gainesville Fire Department, and I am currently serving the role of Support Services Division Chief. I started here March 1st of 1993, so I am on my 30th year with the Gainesville Fire Department. I started as a recruit. I came on as a firefighter, made my way through the promotional ranks, firefighter 2, firefighter 3, which is driver, now called sergeant. A lot of things have changed in 30 years. After driver, I became a lieutenant and a captain on the suppression side. And in 2012, I came into administration as a Support Services Division captain and was over the GSAR Task Force 1 team. I was promoted to Division Chief in 2014. Well, I was hired in 1993 as they constructed Station 3. Before then, we only had 2 stations. So Station 3 was the station in 1993, the main station. And then in Station 2004, they built Station 4, which is on Memorial Park. But in 2004, they constructed Station 4. And while I was a captain, I was stationed out at Station 4 on Memorial Park Road. But since then, now we're in the stages of planning Station 5 and possibly even Station 6. On February 18, 1876, some men called themselves the Gainesville Hook and Ladder Company, and that's the official start date for the Gainesville Fire Department. Throughout history, I do not remember the exact years, but a few years later, the Hook and Ladder went to a complement of African American men, and the original members became the proper name, I'm going to miss it, but it was the Gainesville Fire Company #1. So they had, I think it was 10